Okay, Nisam Bula Vinaka, namaste, kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome, good afternoon, hello. So those of you who don't know me, my name's Jonathan Rowe. I'm the Development Counsellor at the New Zealand High Commission here in Suva, and I've got the pleasure of being your MC for this afternoon. So the lecture we're here to hear is entitled He Waka Eke Noa. We're all in this together. It's about New Zealand's journey to net zero. First of all, in terms of acknowledgements, can I acknowledge people in groups in terms of ministers, leaders, friends, colleagues, members of the Diplomatic Corps. Please welcome. I guess typical New Zealand informality here. Great to have everyone, and we hope you enjoy the show. Firstly, I will actually by name acknowledge the speakers that will be speaking this afternoon, that are here on my left at the head table. So we'll be having some opening remarks from Vice Chancellor and President of USP, Professor Rajesh Chandra, followed by some opening remarks from Fiji's Attorney General and Minister responsible for climate change, Honourable I.T.S. Syed Qayyum. We'll then have a brief introduction by the New Zealand High Commissioner Jonathan Kerr, High Commissioner to New Zealand, and then a keynote address from New Zealand's Minister for Climate Change, Honourable James Shaw. Following the speeches, we will have a short period of question and answers, so please save those up for the end. And afterwards there will be some refreshments served out the side. So on that note, I might invite the Vice-Chancellor to come up and make some welcome remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MC. Honourable Attorney General and Minister responsible for climate change, economy, public enterprises, civil service and communications, Honourable I.T.S. Syed Qayyum, New Zealand's Minister for Climate Change, Honourable James Shaw, New Zealand's High Commissioner to Fiji, His Excellency Mr. Jonathan Kerr, the Pro-Chancellor and Chair of USP Council, Mr. Winston Thompson, Honourable Ministers and senior officials of the Fijian government, the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Dame Meg Taylor, Excellencies and members of the Diplomatic Corps, heads of international and regional organizations, members of USP Council, Senate and the committees, members of USP senior management team, members of staff, students and alumni, members of the media, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Pro-Chancellor and the entire university community, it is my very great honor this afternoon to welcome you all to this public lecture on such a crucial topic. It is indeed a very special occasion when we have the Fijian Attorney General and Minister for Climate Change making opening remarks, and the New Zealand Climate Change Minister presenting a keynote address on New Zealand's journey to net zero. Given the primacy and profile of climate change in Fiji, New Zealand, and the Pacific, and given the fact that this week the COP23 meeting is being hosted by Fiji, it is a perfect opportunity to profile the type of climate innovation and ambition that the Pacific Island countries have been calling for. New Zealand and USP have a very long and significant relationship, starting from 1968 when we inherited the present site from the former Royal New Zealand Flying Boat base at Lodala to today. And over these 50 years, New Zealand has been a large, consistent, and very reliable partner for USP. And I want to acknowledge especially the fact that to mark the 50th anniversary of USP, New Zealand has made a grant of New Zealand $6 million for the upgrade of USP Net, which is the backbone of the entire learning delivery system of USP. So thank you very much. Pacific leaders have called climate change an existential challenge and identified climate change as one of the biggest impediments to sustainable development. USP as an institution has supported the efforts of our leaders in our countries and worked collaboratively with the crop agencies and taken a range of initiatives and activities. We supported COP23 presidency in our Pacific countries with negotiation support. More than 30 USP alumni, students, and staff supported the COP23 presidency of Fiji in Bonn. More than 30 alumni, students, and staff supported more than 8 Pacific countries as part of the negotiating team. We have graduated more than 200 Pacific students with postgraduate degrees in climate change and more than 30 Pacific students in climate with the MSc in climate change, building the human capacity that is needed for tackling climate change. The University of the South Pacific established the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development as a center of excellence in climate change and sustainable development more than 20 years ago, and has recently expanded it with 2 new professorships and additional programs, including the first course on climate finance. The government of RMI and USP have established a joint center, Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transportation, and are both committed to funding the operation of this center. And we are significantly strengthening our role as the leading capacity building and research organization on climate change, resilience, and oceans, working very closely with our crop partners and countries so that we can find innovative solutions to build climate resilience in support of sustainable development. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome all of you again and say how much we look forward to both the Fijian Attorney General and Minister for Climate Change present his opening remarks and to the keynote address by the Honorable James Shaw, which is also being streamed live, and people in the Pacific and elsewhere can view this at www.usp.ac.fj/live. Thank you. Vinaka Vakalebu and Dhanabad.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. Now, before I invite the Honourable Attorney General to speak, we'll just have one important part of the ceremony that our MC was so keen to get into the speeches that he forgot. We have garlanding of our chief guests, so just invite the ladies to do that. Thank you. Thank you, ladies. Right, makes for a much more colourful photo now. Can I now invite the Fiji's Attorney General and Minister responsible for climate change, the Honourable I.S. Said Kayum, to speak to us.
The Honourable Minister James Shaw, Minister for Climate Change from New Zealand, the New Zealand High Commissioner, the Vice-Chancellor. We have other people in the audience. I'd like to, of course, acknowledge the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Fiji, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, the General Secretary, or Secretary General of I.T.S, and also our permanent representative to the United Nations, Dr. Satendra Prasad, who's also a former colleague of many of you from USP, who is now, of course, our permanent representative to the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me much pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'll be very brief. Actually, I'm not feeling too crash-hot, as they say. But I'd like to welcome the Honorable Minister to Fiji. We met for the first time and the last time in Bonn on the margins of COP23, where we had met him for the first time, of course, discussed the very exciting path that New Zealand has actually undertaken with the new New Zealand government. And we are very fortunate enough to have him here this afternoon to hear from him regarding the very ambitious targets and indeed goals that the New Zealand government has put in place to achieve by 2050. These goals, ladies and gentlemen, as we know, are critical in respect of our ability to meet the challenges of climate change. All of us in this room are actually vulnerable to climate change. Not just New Zealanders, not just Fijians, not just Pacific Islanders, but many other citizens, indeed all the citizens of the global community that we all live in. Of course, some of us actually face it more at the cold face of it. We bear the brunt of it because of the fact that we live in a particular region, or given our size and our vulnerability, both from a climatic condition, from geographical position, but also from an economic position. Because the vulnerability, of course, increases when you have small economies that do not necessarily have the resilience built into it. And that resilience is not just about your resilience in your, as human beings, but also about resilience in your infrastructure, resilience in your economy, resilience in the various communities that you do live in. New Zealand, of course, ladies and gentlemen, has been a very keen partner and indeed a very good partner, in particular for Fiji's COP23 efforts. New Zealand has contributed generously, both financially and of course technically, in respect of some of the initiatives that have been undertaken prior to COP23 and of course during COP23 and indeed now post-COP23. Recently, the New Zealand government has made an announcement of an additional New Zealand $2.5 million in funding for this year. Part of this funding will be used to build a Pacific and Agriculture Pavilion COP24 at Katowice, as you know, in Poland, which is where COP24 will be held, which will build a space to showcase the efforts that are being made in the Pacific to build resilience to climate change, particularly in the agricultural sector. This pavilion will also provide an invaluable platform for the world's farmers and all agro-industry stakeholders to engage with an issue critical to global food security and indeed economic prosperity. New Zealand was also very much at the forefront and helped us push sometimes what may be deemed to be controversial initiatives, such as the adoption of the Coronivia joint work on agriculture that will help parties to develop and implement new strategies for adaptation and mitigation within the agricultural sector too. It also partnered with us with the launch of the Local Communities and Indigenous People platform, which is intended to give a greater voice to indigenous peoples and local communities in the climate negotiations and allow them to share their traditional knowledge and best practices on reducing emissions, adapting to climate change, and building resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a list of all the wonderful things that New Zealand intends to do. I do not intend to steal the thunder of the Minister, because I'm sure he's going to talk to us about that. But it is very refreshing for us, indeed in the Pacific, to have a larger economy on the fringes of the Pacific Islands like New Zealand that has taken up this initiative. I'd like to thank them for it. And indeed, they would, we believe, in terms of the announcement that they have made, actually trailblaze what other countries indeed should be doing, in particular economies of their size or even larger economies than theirs. And we take a lot of comfort and solace from the fact that New Zealand has taken this lead. In Fiji, of course, we have, just to share a few things with you, we've had to be, of course, be innovative in terms of our ability to adapt to climate change in particular, because as you know that mitigation really is not that much of an issue for Fiji, although there is an element of mitigation. But many of the Pacific Island countries have very low carbon footprints. So we are more the adaptation space. So funds are actually required for adaptation purposes. And of course, we do have mitigation. We have your nationally determined contributions that Fiji has actually made a commitment to reduce our carbon emissions by 30% by 2030. And we look forward to implementing such issues such as energy efficiency, using more renewable energy, and using, of course, cleaner and greener transportation. And that's one of the things that New Zealand will, of course, I'm sure, talk about and which we want to learn from. However, ladies and gentlemen, we also need the partnership, before I finish off, of all stakeholders. Governments cannot alone do it. We had this morning, for example, the Fiji Employers and Commerce Federation that held, stemming in from the Marrakesh Partnership, where we had the private sector from the various Pacific Island countries coming together to look at issues in terms of how they can actually help reduce the carbon footprint, but not just reducing the carbon footprint, but also trying to actually put in innovation. We need to be a lot more innovative, we need to be a lot more creative in respect of occupying the space that climate change requires us to occupy if we indeed want to reduce the global rising temperatures. So innovation is very critical. We are at the university here. We look forward to the students and indeed the academia to look at ways as to how innovation can actually help us and not just be able to adapt to the changes in climate change, but also to be able to bring about innovation that will create efficiency, energy efficiency, and various other techniques and technology that will help us meet these challenges, which is actually, as our MC stated, is an existential threat. As the VC has said, many Pacific Island countries see that, and indeed it is one for all of us. So ladies and gentlemen, with those introductory remarks, I'd like to once again thank all of you for your presence here, and of course, thank the Honourable Minister and his team for being here, and we look forward to hearing from him. Binaka, thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, I'd now like to invite New Zealand High Commissioner to Fiji and my boss, His Excellency Jonathan Kerr.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon. The Honourable James Shaw has been the New Zealand Minister for Climate Change, Minister of Statistics, and Associate Minister of Finance since October 2017. Minister Shaw has a long association with environmentalism, having joined the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand in 1990. He was elected as a Member of Parliament in 2014, standing for the Green Party in Wellington Central. He was elected Green Party co-leader in 2015. Prior to becoming an MP, Minister Shaw had a successful career in management consulting, primarily in London, where he lived from 1998 until 2010. He has worked with large multinational companies, including PricewaterhouseCoopers and HSBC Bank across Europe and the world, helping them develop more sustainable business practices. He was born in Wellington and studied at Victoria University. He later completed a Master of Science in Sustainability and Business Leadership at the University of Bath School of Management. Recently, the Minister has been leading the government's consultation on a draft bill that would enshrine in law a net zero carbon target for New Zealand by 2050. He has encouraged New Zealanders, and I'm sure will encourage you all today, to see responding to climate change as an opportunity and an investment rather than simply a cost to bear, and has likened the transformational response required of us and our economies over the next 30 years to the internet revolution that has taken place over the last 30 years. In 1988, most of us probably didn't know what the internet was. Today, I haven't met a Fijian or a New Zealander who doesn't hold the internet in the palm of their hand. I hope I've whetted your appetite. Without further ado, New Zealand's Minister for Climate Change, the Honourable James Shaw.
Nisa Bulavanaka, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for coming out and spending the afternoon with us. I really appreciate your time. It's wonderful to be back in Fiji. This is my second trip, my first as a government minister. The first time I was here was with my wife on a slightly more romantic trip than one when we're talking about climate change. Attorney General, thank you for your very kind words and for being with us this afternoon. Thank you for having me here. Vice-Chancellor, thank you for hosting us. High Commissioner, thank you for your warm words of introduction. To say that I studied at Victoria University was probably an overstatement, but That was certainly the university I consistently enrolled in for several years. Excellencies, Dame Meg, thank you very much for coming out, and Excellencies from Fiji and from all over the Pacific Basin. Thank you very much for your time. It is a great pleasure and an honour to be with you this afternoon. I do want to start with some very warm words of thanks for our hosts, Fiji, who have shown, I think, great leadership in their presidency of the 23rd United Nations Climate Change Conference of Parties, or COP23. We cannot underestimate the message that it sends internationally that a Pacific island nation like Fiji holds this important role. It's the first time that it's happened. It's incredibly significant. All of us here, as Pacific nations, understand the importance of making sure that the world does not ignore the very serious impacts that climate change has on some of the world's most vulnerable countries. And Fiji, I think, has used its position in the COP presidency to great effect in that regard. Because here in the Pacific, we are talking about some of the smallest island nations on Earth located in the largest ocean on Earth. And that huge ocean is being subjected to some of the greatest forces of change that humanity has ever known in our entire time on this planet. And we cannot ignore what that means here in our part of the world. Many of you will know this, of course. Fiji's Lau Island group to the south couldn't ignore what that means when they were hit by Tropical Cyclone Gita earlier this year, along with Samoa and Tonga, and also parts of New Zealand. We're seeing what climate change means here in the Pacific, and we are also seeing it more frequently. So we must not, and we will not, be ignored when it comes to global decision-making to deal with climate change. And though we may each be relatively small countries, together we are being heard. As Samoa's Prime Minister, the Honourable Tuila Lepa, reminded us earlier this year when he spoke at the second Pacific Climate Change Conference in Wellington, Pacific Island countries were instrumental back in 2015 in concluding the tough global negotiations that saw the Paris Agreement adopted. It was actually the tireless work of Pacific leaders and their delegations that made the world see climate change through the eyes of vulnerable island communities. Those efforts were decisive in the Paris Agreement, including a goal to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. I saw some of those impacts myself when I joined our Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern, on visits to Tonga, Niue, the Cook Islands and Samoa in March of this year. I remember meeting a group of school children in Samoa who made their daily trip to school across a walk bridge because sea level rise had made that the only way to get to school, and yet now even that walkway itself was also underwater and they were needing to build upon it and build a higher platform. And I saw through the eyes of a Tongan school community the challenges that they faced in rebuilding their school after Cyclone Gita's devastating damage just a few weeks before our visit got there. Those realities are becoming all too frequent and much more severe in the Pacific now, and they serve as real reminders of why we cannot let the Paris Agreement fail. We cannot. It is a vital agreement to help the world chart a course that we must follow if we're to address the realities that are facing many people here in the Pacific. The Paris Agreement, it hasn't just given us a global consensus, but it's given us the target, which I personally believe is achievable, to reduce the world's climate-producing emissions to net zero in the second half of this century. We have a clear shared purpose now, like we've never had before. But the work is, I was going to say it's far from done, but it's also almost far from getting started. Your own Prime Minister Prime Minister Bainimarama said earlier this year, we need to get the message out loud and clear to the entire world about the absolute need to confront this crisis head on. And an essential part of that is maintaining the momentum of Paris and building upon it. That has to happen when we go to Poland at the end of this year for COP24. We must agree the guidelines for implementing the Paris Agreement at this next Conference of Parties. So in that light, I would like to share with you some of the work that is happening in New Zealand. And I have to say, it does feel like we have a new and exciting momentum building around climate change. Last week, we completed a month and a half of public consultation seeking feedback and ideas across New Zealand on legislation that I plan to introduce later this year in the form of a zero carbon bill. The zero carbon bill will set the target in law, as the Attorney General mentioned. It will be a long-term commitment for New Zealand's transition to a net zero emissions economy. It will provide certainty for businesses, for households, for local government, so that they can make confident decisions about the investments that they need to make over the coming decades. The Commission will provide the Zero Carbon Bill will also establish a politically independent Climate Change Commission, which will provide independent expert advice to the government about the emissions budgets that are needed in the short to medium term in order to reach our 2050 target. Having an independent body to provide such advice helps to take the politics out of climate change and could help to hold successive governments to account for progress on emissions reductions. That should help to ensure that future governments, whoever is in government, that commitment to shifting to a low emissions economy will continue. We're also about to start to seek feedback on ideas for improving our emissions trading scheme to ensure that it is a scheme which is robust, which has integrity, and which actually works to cut emissions. What's equally exciting is the momentum that is building in the business sector and in farming and agriculture in New Zealand to take action where they can to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So earlier this month, 60 of New Zealand's leading businesses announced that as a coalition, they support the Paris Agreement. They see the low emissions economy as an opportunity to improve New Zealand's prosperity. So they have committed to measuring and reporting regularly on their reductions in greenhouse gases. And they're also going to help the companies in their supply chain to do the same. Together, that group of 60 businesses and their suppliers makes up nearly 50% of New Zealand's total greenhouse gas emissions output. Right? Just those 60 businesses and their supply chains makes up pretty much half of our total emissions output. So if those 60 businesses achieve their goal, well, New Zealand is halfway there already. And there is also support coming from the agricultural sector. Agricultural emissions make up about 49% of New Zealand's emissions and a massive portion of our economy and of our exports. So I am very grateful for the support from farming leaders in New Zealand who are backing the transition as well to a low emissions economy. Farmers that I visit around various parts of New Zealand are doing some incredible things to farm more efficiently, more sustainably, and to cut emissions at the same time. Last week, there was an opinion poll which was commissioned by one of New Zealand's leading insurance companies, IAG. And the fact that it was commissioned by an insurance company probably shouldn't be lost on anyone, because as the Attorney General said, while we have to focus on, and certainly in New Zealand, we have to focus on mitigation in our efforts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we are also becoming very aware that we have a pretty substantial adaptation challenge ahead of us as well. One recent study suggested that from sea level rise alone, so ignoring drought and storms and floods and fires and everything else, just from sea level rise, we have at risk 5 regional airports, 46 kilometres of railway, over 1,500 kilometres of road, and 70,000 residential and business buildings at risk from sea level rise at a replacement cost of around 19 billion New Zealand dollars. So you can see why the insurance companies are interested in what New Zealand think about climate change. So 79% of the 1,000 people who took part in that poll said that New Zealand needs to act now on climate change. 79% say we must act now. 78% thought that New Zealand should act even if other countries don't. That is significant. That really does feel like momentum is building back home. Another part of our work, which I'm also responsible for with my associate finance hat on, involves setting up a green investment fund. Our government has committed 100 million New Zealand dollars in initial capital for the fund on the understanding that it will become self-sustaining in ventures that provide crucial projects for New Zealand's change to a low-emissions, climate-friendly economy. What I also feel is valuable, and I think will be reinforced by the success of the Green Investment Fund, is that this is a financing vehicle which looks at action on climate change as an investment, not as a sunk cost. Because if we look for projects that line up with low emissions and climate adaptation and which generate a financial return, we are going to find solutions to help us meet our climate change obligations. It's already happening. Business leaders like the 60 company bosses I mentioned just before aren't just cutting emissions because it's the right thing to do, although it is the right thing to do. They are doing it also because they know that it is the way that they will survive and thrive in the future. As a representative of one of New Zealand's main electricity companies said the other night at an event that we attended, and this is a company that's generating 100% of its electricity from clean renewable sources. By the way, she said, sustainable businesses will be successful businesses. Those that are not sustainable will fail. And those are words from one of New Zealand's largest companies. That is some of what we're doing at home. And we do know that we need to do it as part of a wider effort. We know that an important part of our program to deal with climate change is working with Pacific partners to understand their needs and their priorities and how we can help each other to achieve them. It's why the New Zealand government's Pacific Reset recognises climate change as a high priority for the Pacific, if not the highest priority for the Pacific. It's why helping the Pacific to tackle climate change and adapt to its impacts will be a priority for the over $700 million of new development cooperation funding that New Zealand will spend over the next 4 years. We do want to work alongside our Pacific partners to find regional solutions to our shared challenges, including climate change. Working together has to be at the very heart of how we and the rest of the world are going to succeed in meeting the challenges of climate change. And I feel that we are now finally starting to understand that in New Zealand. We have a group called Global Legislators Organisation for a Balanced Environment, or GLOBE, NZ for short. This is made up of all of the parties in Parliament, all 6 parties in Parliament, all 5 parties in Parliament, and it's dedicated to achieving cross-party agreement on climate change policy. And also we now have the commitment of the opposition National Party saying that they support an independent climate change commission and an evidence-based approach to action on climate change. They have also indicated that they'd be willing to work with us on drafting the zero carbon bill, and I'm keen to take them up on that, because I believe that bipartisan support for the bill as it passes through Parliament can only help to create that sense of certainty that is so desperately needed about our long-term future direction. Has to be about cooperation. And that is, of course, absolutely central to this year's Talanoa Dialogue, where our shared stories help us to understand where we are now on climate change, where we want to go in addressing climate change, and how we plan to get there. So where do we go from here? Well, firstly, as I said, we need COP24 to reach agreement on implementation guidelines for the Paris Agreement. We have to have that. I'd also like to see COP24 embrace a positive Talanoa dialogue which can help to inform countries' thinking on future ambition and action to address climate change. We, as a Pacific family with shared interests, need to maximise our strength together and set an example to other small nations around the world that we do have a significant contribution to make in addressing climate change. I'm constantly challenged at home by people who say that New Zealand creates less than 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, so therefore why should we bother tying ourselves to being net zero by 2050? But of the 197 countries who signed up to the Paris Agreement, most of us create less than 1% of the world's emissions. For those countries, which include New Zealand and include Pacific Island countries, whilst our individual contribution to the global total is small, together we make up more than 20% of the total. Together we make up as much as Europe or India or China, some of the largest players. Being small is no excuse for inaction. Quite the opposite. It actually gives us the opportunity to be world leaders by taking collective action. We need to be a part of the global economic transformation that is underway and which is not going to be reversed. And we need to seize our share of the opportunities that can come from that transformation. The thinking is changing. Rather than trying to ignore action on climate change because it costs too much, which is the traditional thinking, we're seeing both at the governmental level and in the private sector that responding to climate change is an investment in the future. And we're also seeing through initiatives like the Talanoa Dialogue that the language of blame is shifting to discussion about how we can work together to secure a better future. Talanoa also reminds us, very importantly, that climate change response has to have people at its centre, providing support for those who need it, and building a consensus amongst our citizens about the changes that need to be made. I firmly believe that one of the keys to the success in dealing with climate change is to break down traditional political barriers. Climate change is bigger than politics. It's way bigger than politics. It's why we need to work across party lines with groups like Globe NZ to try and find common understanding and commitment around climate policy. And the Globe model is in place in many countries and regions around the world. A similar grouping in the Pacific may be an idea worth exploring. I believe that one of the best chances to advance the achievements that have already been made with our fellow signatories in Paris is to reinforce that notion that we are all in the same waka, he waka eke noa. We are all in this together. That notion, combined with what Fiji has so successfully created this year with the Talanoa Dialogue, provides, I think, a really constructive way forward to engage with what has to be our shared purpose. And that purpose is to see our people thrive for generations to come. Vinaka Vakilevu. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we do have maybe 5 or 10 minutes here for a brief question and answer session. So we do have several gentlemen with microphones. If anyone would like to ask a question, please just state your name, the name of your organisation, if you're representing someone in that capacity, and then ask your question. So any interest? The gentleman here with the red shirt.
Jesse. Thank you very much, Honourable Minister, for a very inspirational and hopeful speech. I'm Willie, originally from Samoa, now working in the University of South Pacific. My story is that I'm here today because of the pathways created by the 2 scholarships from the New Zealand government about 20 years ago. So I am not that old. The interesting thing, the common thing that I got from your keynote address, sir, is that human capacity is very important. And development of high-level information, skills, and knowledge is very important to make informed decisions at all levels for adaptation and resilience, and creating, in order for us to reach zero net emission. So my question is, how many scholarships in the next 4 years you are going to provide in the field of climate change? And how much fund you are going to provide to support Pacific-led research in order to create this knowledge, these skills, and these capacities in order for us to have evidence-based adaptation and well-informed mitigation activities in order for the Pacific Islands to reach net zero emission. Because investing in the Pacific Islands and Pacific Islanders also benefits New Zealand in a huge, huge way. Look at your All Blacks, for example. Thank you very much.
Well, I was going to say you do not look old enough to have arrived here 20 years ago. So I noticed that our officials from Foreign Affairs and Trade are busy scribbling notes, and we're going to direct your question to the aid team back in Wellington. So I mean, I can't answer the specifics of things like how many scholarships and so on, but we have, I think I mentioned it in the speech, we have substantially increased our overall Pacific aid budget this year to just over about 750 million, or by about $750 million or so, and we know that climate change is, if not the top, then certainly one of the top 3 priorities for all of the countries in the Pacific that we have that kind of relationship with. So and the approach that we take to that is that we want that to be led by our partners, not by what we think is important. So if you think that scholarships and capacity building is of primary importance, then we would take that on board.
Thank you, Minister. Right, well, several hands. Maybe right up the top, the lady in the shawl.
Good afternoon, Honourable Ministers. My name is Nicola. I'm a citizen of the Pacific. I just had one question. Minister Shaw, you noted the success of the facilitative dialogue, Talanoa facilitative dialogue, and I note that we have leaders in town this week for CAP. I wanted to see what yours and the Honourable Minister from Fiji's views were on the key achievements you wanted to see out of the facilitative dialogue, both for the region and what you're taking to COP24.
We normally say guests first. Look, I mean, the Talanoa dialogue, actually before that I wanted to say that I really enjoyed the Honourable Minister's speech. and I wish I could get him in front of the opposition parties so they would understand the importance of climate change and indeed what Fiji has been doing on the global stage. I see that some of them are there. The Talanoa dialogue actually has been quite successful, and indeed recently when we had the gathering, the May gathering in Bonn, many of the people who did come back, the feedback was phenomenal. In fact, it has been adopted quite significantly, even in the continent of Africa. Whenever they have meetings now, everybody refers to Talanoa dialogue. And I think the CAP event, of course, as you know, a number of the Pacific leaders are here. We have, probably as we are speaking, they have got the opening ceremony for that. All the Pacific leaders are coming to that. The idea is, of course, to be able to have that level of leverage and also that ability to consolidate our efforts. As the Honourable Minister did say, whilst notwithstanding the fact that we may have very low carbon footprint, we may not necessarily be the largest economies, we may not necessarily have the largest military and the financial markets around us. The fact of the matter is we are sovereign states. The fact of the matter is that if we come together, we do account for a significant proportion of the countries in the world on the global stage. And one of the outcomes, of course, would be to be able to take that consolidated position to Katowice, and of course, going forward too, beyond COP24. That is really critical because, as you know, the Paris Agreement comes into full implementation by 2020. The rule book needs to be developed. The rule book is about the implementation of the Paris Agreement. What are the ground rules pertaining to that? How we are going to implement the NDCs, the monitoring of NDCs, the evaluation of NDCs, all of those things come into play. And of course, it's also the commitments, the financial commitments that are going to be made by countries. We have a target of $1 billion. And of course, as you know, without saying too much of it, there's been a bit of seesawing in recent times on the global stage politically. Some people may try and, as we had some discussions today, we had a meeting today with the Australian ambassador for climate change, Patrick Suckling, who's in town too. And we talked about how those dynamics are at play. So it makes it even more critical to ensure that the Talanoa dialogue, the facilitative dialogue, actually plays a pivotal role in getting everybody together. And as we all know in the Pacific, the Talanoa dialogue, the spirit of it is that you don't do for finger pointing, but the idea is to have some level of consensus. And that is very critical in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement come 2020. This is in short. Thanks.
So, just to build on what the Attorney General said, as I see it, the international negotiations process, it's a very tortured and difficult process, as we well know. We've been at it for 24 years, right? My experience is that when you talk to representatives from any country in the world, and I mean any country in the world, they all fully grasp the scale and the nature of the climate change challenge for all of us. And the vast majority of countries are engaged in some level of kind of moving down that path. Some of them very aggressively, some not so aggressively. One's kind of walking backwards. But, generally speaking, everyone's kind of moving down that path. And yet when it comes to the kind of international negotiations process, it immediately devolves into like a zero-sum game where every country is trying to defend its national interests as if our national interests were somehow served by making no progress on climate change, when actually our national interests are best served by us all, winning together, right? And so I kind of see the Talanoa dialogue and I guess the genius of the Talanoa dialogue that Fiji's brought to this as it tries to short-circuit that kind of traditional, intergovernmental negotiation process through the kind of storytelling and experience sharing process, which opens up a different access way because it is through the telling of stories. It's a kind of a constructive cycle that kind of builds and builds on itself, rather than kind of one that funnels down to the lowest common denominator, which is generally what happens in negotiations. And so I kind of hope, to answer your question, what comes out of the Talanoa dialogue in terms of this year's negotiations is that it helps to convert that process into one where people actually remember what we're all there to do, and stop treating this like it's a zero-sum game and something that actually we only win individually as countries if we all win together.
Okay, maybe one or two more. Gentleman here.
Thank you, Honourable Minister from New Zealand. Not really a question, but with your progressive government's plans, I'm really interested to gauge what's New Zealand's plans about these climate refugees. Thank you.
So this is one of the most sensitive issues that we are facing, right? Is essentially the issue of forced migration as a result of the impacts of climate change, and in particular sea level rise. And our guiding principle, like the first principle that we've got, is that people should be able to remain in their homelands with dignity. Right? That is the overriding principle. That we shouldn't get to the point where there is climate migration. We don't want to get to that point. That's why the 1.5 degree goal is so important. And also, in terms of the work that we're doing with our Pacific partners, particularly in relation to adaptation, it's around building resilience so that that doesn't become necessary. And that's the message that we've received, right, in conversations that we've had over the past sort of kind of few years, is that that's got to be the guiding principle, because we don't want to admit defeat, right? And we also know that there is an element of risk and an uncertain future. And so there is a conversation that we've got to have about, kind of what happens in kind of the worst case scenario if we kind of get to that point. And it's not just a question of migration or refugees. It's actually a conversation about nationhood and statehood and culture and language and those kinds of questions. And so the question around migration or refugees or the movements of people, I think, has to take place within that context. Because the worst thing, I think the very worst thing that could happen, is that you would see a peoples moving, translocating somewhere, and then simply becoming absorbed within the host community within 2 or 3 generations, losing its culture, losing its language, and losing its identity. And so I think that the most important thing that we've got to do is to focus on that context of how do you maintain a nation and a culture and an identity and a language in a world where we may see significant movements of people, not just in the Pacific, but in other parts of the world as well. So that's kind of the view that we're taking. But I want to come back to that first principle, which is that we want to be led by and guided by what our Pacific partners want and what their priorities are. And so that conversation is one that I feel has to be led from that place, rather than one where we say, hey, we've got this great idea, or we know what's best, or anything like that. That, I think, risks repeating some of history's mistakes.
Yeah.
I think, there's obviously a lot of issues that Fiji discussed about climate change refugees. But I think the other point we need to be mindful of is what we call IDPs, internally displaced persons too. So you may not necessarily have people migrating or having to migrate because of loss of land or loss of their country, because it's gone underwater, or desertification in some of the countries like in Africa. But you have people actually moving from one location where they may have been for generations to another location. And we've already done that for 3 villages in Fiji, We've identified another 43 villages that actually have to be moved to higher ground. Now, some of these are actually lucky because they may have land just behind where they used to live up on higher ground, but others may not be so lucky. And again, you have the whole issue about loss of artifacts, loss of cemeteries, loss of certain livelihoods that they may have been dependent upon, but now they no longer can have that source of livelihood. So there's a whole issue surrounding that too, and that's something that we have to deal with internally, and that requires a whole new discourse, a new way of thinking as to how do we actually move people from within their own country. Sometimes it may reach a situation where the landowning unit may actually no longer be able to live on their land that they actually own. They may actually have to move to another landowning unit's land. That, of course, presents a whole new other range of issues and challenges, and that's something to also consider.
That is a good point. And we have that issue in New Zealand as well, actually. The 70,000 buildings that I was referring to that are at risk from sea level rise, those are communities. And so part of our challenge is to work out, and we've already got some communities that are thinking through how they adapt and move as well.
Okay, maybe time for one last question. No? Otherwise? Oh, late hand. Down the front left.
Thank you. I'm Thomas Bauer from the School of Tourism and Hospitality Management at USP. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation, Minister. You're focusing on carbon, which is great, but as we know, methane is an even worse greenhouse gas. Now, from what I know, you have a few million sheep and cows in New Zealand. So how are you going to incorporate them into the equation? Thank you.
Just a few million. So you're right. So when I was talking about greenhouse gas emissions, I was being inclusive. So I wasn't just referring to carbon dioxide. And I think I mentioned at one point, agriculture makes up 49% of our emissions. The majority of that, over 2/3 of that 49%, is methane. The remainder is from nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is actually a real problem because, like carbon dioxide, it lasts for centuries in the atmosphere. Methane's slightly easier to manage because it rotates out of the atmosphere at a faster rate, although while it's in the atmosphere, it's many times more damaging and so on. So this is the thing that, in some ways I think that we're making the most progress on, because agriculture is the backbone of the New Zealand economy. That's kind of the leading cliche in New Zealand. Agriculture is the backbone of the New Zealand economy, has been our entire modern history, post-colonial history. That how you incorporate agriculture when there isn't an easy technological switch for methane, where there is a technological switch for carbon dioxide, but there isn't for methane easily, or in fact even for nitrous oxide, how you handle that has been our greatest challenge. So for 20 years we've made pretty much no progress in that regard because of that. And it's by flipping this mentality that dealing with climate change is a sunk cost, flipping that mentality into this is an economic opportunity for us, or this can be an economic opportunity for us, and an investment in our future, that's where we're starting to see progress. So I'll give you an example. We've got a dairy processing company called Synlait. It's not the largest, it's quite a small one by comparison to the really big one. And they made a commitment recently that they would reduce on-farm emissions, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, by 30% on their farms in the next 10 years, just using existing technology and best practice. So no magic bullets, no new science or anything like that, just existing technology and best practice. And the reason that they feel confident making that assertion is because over the last several years they've worked with their best performing farms, discovered that they had an emissions profile that was 30% lower than the median, and so are now applying what those best practice farms are doing across the entire group, right, of farms. Now, and they're doing other things as well, right? They're putting in the country's first electric milk powder drying unit. Previously, we've used coal because it's cheap and easy to transport. Even though the cost of that unit is twice what a coal-fired unit will be, because they know that in the life of that unit, coal will become non-viable or non-economic, whereas electricity will become much more viable. And they also know, they're taking quite a big punt on this, but they are convinced that there is a premium market for kind of net zero dairy products. They think the premium is about 25% on the average price. So when you put all these factors together, they're actually turning this whole thing into, well, where's the opportunity here? And for us as a commodity country, who have always struggled with productivity, it's our greatest economic challenge, is how do you move from being a commodity volume producer to a more highly productive, high value end producer. That is the, sustainability, zero emissions and so on, actually is the driver of productivity and performance. And to me, that's what's exciting. And so more and more of our businesses in the agricultural sector are embracing that. And it comes with reducing emissions. So the economic incentives become aligned at last with the environmental outcomes that we want to achieve.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, can we put our hands together for our speakers? Okay, so that's the end of the show. Can I just offer some thanks, firstly to our speakers, our two ministers here and our other speakers as well. Thank you everyone for attending. Really appreciate your support. Hopefully some of the ideas and discussion that's had here you'll reflect on and take back to your own talanoas. Also, thank you for those people that are listening or signing in and listening online or watching online if your bandwidth is fast enough. Also to our media friends and colleagues for covering the event, and just safe travels after this. So whanaka waka levu, and have a good evening. Thank you.